My name is Miller Files. I have spent most of my career following crimes that refuse to stay buried. Some cases scream for attention. Others disappear quietly, absorbed by time, paperwork, and indifference. The Texas killing fields belong to the second kind. If you drive south from Houston toward Galveston, there is a stretch of road that offers no warning, no sign, no marker, no memorial. Just flat land, tall grass, and the constant wind coming off the Gulf. It looks like nothing, and that is exactly why it worked. This land did not become infamous overnight. It earned its reputation slowly, one missing girl at a time. In the early 1970s, young women around Galveston County began to vanish. At first, the disappearances seemed unrelated. Different neighborhoods, different backgrounds, different lives. Some were teenagers still living at home. Some were young women trying to survive in the needs of society. Police files treated each case as its own isolated problem. A runaway, a bad decision, a temporary disappearance. But the land was already learning something. It learned that bodies left here stayed hidden longer. It learned that time erased evidence faster than any human hand. It learned that if no one connected the dots, the ground could keep its secrets. The area later called the Texas Killing Fields is not a single field. It is a collection of neglected spaces near Calder Road in League City. Marshland, drainage, ditches, unfinished developments, abandoned by builders who ran out of money or patience. This was not wilderness. It was worse. It was forgotten land sitting beside one of the busiest highways in Texas. Thousands of cars passed every day, families on vacation, truck drivers heading south, commuters focused on the road ahead. No one looked long enough to notice what the land was holding. The first bodies did not arrive all at once. They appeared years apart. Sometimes only bones were found. Sometimes clothing. Sometimes nothing that could clearly explain how a young woman ended up there. Death certificates used cautious language. Cause undetermined. Remains incomplete. Investigation ongoing. Behind those phrases were families asking the same question over and over again. Where did she go when detectives walked these fields? They were not hunting a killer yet. They were searching for answers that had already started to dissolve. The soil was soft. The water moved constantly. Animals disturbed shallow graves. Weather erased footprints within hours. This land was not just a dumping ground. It was an accomplice. By the late 1970s, investigators began to sense a pattern, but they lacked the tools and coordination to prove it. Different police departments handled different cases. Information did not flow easily across county lines. Files sat in cabinets instead of databases. Most importantly, many of the victims did not fit the image of people society rushed to protect. Some lived unstable lives. Some had already been written off, and when a victim is treated as expendable, the urgency to solve her case disappears with her. Looking back now, the warning signs are impossible to miss. But at the time, each disappearance felt small, manageable, temporary. No one was prepared to accept that a place could become dangerous simply because it had proven useful to evil. The Texas killing fields were not created by a mastermind. They were created by neglect, and in that neglect, something took root. something that would claim more lives long before anyone gave it a name. I am Miller Files, and this is where the story truly begins. My name is Miller Files. If you want to understand how the Texas killing fields were allowed to exist for decades, you have to start with the victims, not as a list, not as statistics, but as individual lives that were never connected soon enough. Each girl vanished into her own file, her own folder, her own quiet tragedy. That separation is what allowed everything else to happen. In Galveston County, disappearance was treated as a personal event, not a public warning. A girl missing from League City was not immediately linked to a girl missing from Dickinson. A teenager who never came home one night was not connected to a young woman found years later in a drainage ditch. Each case lived alone. Some of the girls were reported missing within hours. Their families called police. Neighbors searched the streets. Friends handed out flyers. These families did everything they were supposed to do. They trusted the system to protect their daughters. Other girls did not receive the same urgency. If a victim had run away before, her disappearance was framed as a choice. If she struggled at home, the case was softened with assumptions. If she lived on the edge of society, her absence did not set off alarms. The system made judgments early. Those judgments followed the cases forever. One teenage girl disappeared after being seen near a convenience store. Another vanished while walking a familiar route she had taken dozens of times before. Another left home for an errand and was never seen again. Different ages, different stories, different lives. What they shared was invisible at first. They were female. They were vulnerable at a moment when someone was watching, and they crossed paths with a person who understood how easy it was for them to disappear. When remains were discovered in the fields, they rarely brought clarity. Identification took time, sometimes years. Sometimes it never came. Without DNA databases, investigators relied on dental records, clothing, jewelry, and missing person reports that were often incomplete. By the time a name was attached to a body, the trail was already cold. Families were called into police stations and shown fragments of evidence that could never tell the full story. A shoe, a necklace, a partial skeleton. Mothers were asked to identify their daughters from things instead of faces. The emotional cost was permanent. Some families refused to accept vague conclusions. They pushed investigators. They asked uncomfortable questions. They demanded follow-ups. Others were worn down by time. Years passed with no updates. Phone calls stopped coming. Detectives retired or transferred. New officers inherited files without context or urgency. The girls faded into paperwork. What made this especially dangerous was the illusion of randomness. Because the victims came from different backgrounds, no single warning ever reached the public. There was no clear description of who was at risk, no consistent pattern for parents to fear, and so life continued normally around the fields. Teenagers still hitchhiked. Young women still walked alone. Families still believed their communities were safe. Meanwhile, the land continued to receive the bodies of girls who never became part of a recognized series. In hindsight, investigators now see what they missed. Not a single predator following a rigid script, but a repeated opportunity. Someone or several people learned that these disappearances would not be connected quickly enough to stop them. Every unlinked case created confidence. Confidence that the next girl would also vanish quietly. As a detective, this is the part of the story that hurts the most, not because of what the killer did, but because of what the system failed to do. No one stood back far enough to see the whole picture. By the time authorities began to suspect a larger pattern, the damage was already deep. Years of evidence had been lost to weather, animals, and neglect. Witness memories had faded. Potential suspects had moved away or died. The girls were gone, and their stories, once separated, were now almost impossible to reunite. I am Miller Files, and in the next chapter, we confront the place itself, because the Texas killing fields were not just a location, they were a lesson in how silence becomes permission. My name is Miller Files. In every long-running murder investigation, there comes a moment when you stop looking only at people and start looking at places. Because sometimes the killer is not just a person. Sometimes it is geography. Sometimes it is infrastructure. Sometimes it is a stretch of land that quietly makes crime easier. The Texas killing fields were not chosen by accident. They were discovered. Calder Road runs through an area that never fully decided what it wanted to be. It was not rural enough to be protected by isolation and not urban enough to be protected by attention. Development started and stopped. Projects were abandoned. Drainage systems were cut into the land and left open. What remained was a patchwork of empty space that no one claimed responsibility for. To an investigator, this kind of land is a nightmare. To someone looking to hide a body, it is an invitation. The soil here is soft and wet most of the year. Digging does not require strength or time. A shallow grave is enough. Water moves constantly through the ground, distorting timelines of decomposition. Animals disturb remains before investigators ever arrive. Evidence does not rest here. It dissolves. Even when a body is found, the scene rarely tells the truth. Clothing is displaced. Bones are scattered. Injuries that might explain cause of death are erased by time and environment. This creates a dangerous ambiguity. Was she killed here or somewhere else? Was she left alive or already dead? Was there one person involved or more? The land refuses to answer. But the location offers something even more important than concealment. It offers access. The fields sit beside Interstate 45, one of the busiest corridors in Texas. That highway connects major cities, ports, and industries. It carries tourists, commuters, and long-haul drivers day and night. That matters, because a killer does not need to live here to use this place. He only needs to pass through. A vehicle can leave Houston, stop briefly, and continue south without drawing attention. A car parked for a few minutes near an empty lot does not raise suspicion, especially at night, especially in an area already known for abandonment. This is how a place becomes reusable. Over time, the fields developed a reputation among investigators as difficult, frustrating, and uncooperative. Scenes produced few leads. Tips led nowhere. Patterns refused to stabilize. And that reputation spread quietly in another direction as well. Someone realized that bodies left here stayed unsolved. That realization does not require intelligence or planning on a grand scale. It only requires observation, a newspaper article, a local rumor, a passing comment. This is how opportunity becomes method. When people imagine serial crime, they picture a signature, a ritual, a distinct psychological profile. But the Texas killing fields challenge that idea. What if the consistency was not the killer, but the place? Different hands, different motives, same result. The land did not care who brought the body. As years passed, investigators returned to the same locations again and again, each time hoping for something new, each time finding the same emptiness. Technology improved. DNA analysis advanced. Databases expanded. But these cases were already old. Evidence was gone. Witnesses were gone. Some victims were never identified. Cold cases do not stay cold because no one tries. They stay cold because too much time passes in the wrong environment. Standing in these fields today, you can still see why they worked. The distance from the road is short. The cover is natural. The silence is constant. No one screams here. No one watches. This is not a dramatic killing ground. It is a quiet one. And that is what makes it so effective. When investigators finally began to publicly acknowledge the Texas killing fields as a connected phenomenon, the damage had already been done. The place had served its purpose for too long. It had hidden victims, it had discouraged solutions, and it had taught whoever was watching that this was where consequences went to disappear. I am Miller Files. In the next chapter, we turn back to the people who may have understood this lesson too well, because places do not choose themselves. Someone always has to notice first. My name is Miller Files. When investigators finally accepted that the Texas killing fields were more than coincidence, the focus shifted back to people. Not masterminds, just men who moved through this place without ever being held long enough to answer the hardest questions. The most unsettling truth about this case is not that suspects were guilty. It is that there were too many of them. This stretch of Texas sits at a crossroads of movement. Truck routes, industrial labor, temporary housing. Men who arrive for work and leave when the job is done. Faces that blend into highways and disappear into the next city. In cases like this, suspicion does not fall on one shadow. It spreads outward, touching dozens of lives that never intersect on paper. There were men who lived nearby and knew the land intimately. They hunted. They fished. They understood where water pooled and where vehicles could stop unseen. Some had violent histories. Some did not. There were men who passed through for a night or a week. Truck drivers, seasonal workers, travelers whose names were written once in a logbook and never again. And there were men who spoke too much. One former police officer claimed responsibility for multiple murders. He offered details, he told stories, but stories are not evidence. Confessions without proof become noise, and noise can drown real answers. Another man was convicted in a single, related killing. His presence near the fields was undeniable. His violence was proven. But the evidence did not stretch far enough to wrap the entire history around him. This is where public frustration begins to boil. People want a face, a name, a sentence that ends with justice served. But investigations do not close themselves for the sake of comfort. They close when facts allow it. And here, facts refuse to align. What investigators encountered instead was a pattern of opportunity rather than identity. Men with access to vehicles, men comfortable with isolation, men who noticed how easy it was for a girl to disappear along these roads. None of this creates a single portrait. It creates a crowd. Each suspect explained one fragment of the story. None explained it all. As the years passed, law enforcement agencies re-examined old files. They compared notes. They ran new forensic tests when technology allowed. Sometimes DNA spoke. Often it stayed silent. Witnesses' aged memories softened. Statements changed. A man who seemed suspicious in 1985 became impossible to place in 1995. And then there was time. Time removes urgency. It turns open investigations into archived boxes. It retires detectives and buries instincts alongside them. Families watched suspects fade into the background. Men died without charges. Men moved away. Men continued their lives untouched by suspicion. That reality is hard to accept. It forces us to confront something uncomfortable. The Texas killing fields may not have one villain. They may have had many. Different men, different crimes. One shared advantage. They understood the land would protect them. This is not a failure of imagination. It is a failure of structure. Systems built to catch one offender's struggle when the threat behaves like a tide instead of a storm. By the time the idea of multiple perpetrators became publicly acknowledged, the window for accountability had narrowed. Too much had passed. I Am Miller Files. In the final chapter, we examine what remains. Not suspects, not theories, but the weight of unanswered questions and the cost of letting them stay unanswered. My name is Miller Files. When the noise fades and the investigations stop producing new names, a case does not end. It changes shape. It becomes something heavier, something that lives in memory instead of evidence. That is what remains in the Texas killing fields. There is no courtroom ending to this story. No moment when a verdict brings relief. The fields still sit beside the highway, unchanged, absorbing traffic and weather and time. People still drive past without knowing what happened just beyond the grass. For families, the absence of answers is not an abstract idea. It is daily life. It is waking up every morning with the same question and no new way to ask it. It is birthdays that stop being celebrated. It is rooms left untouched. Grief does not need certainty to exist, but it needs truth to heal. In the decades since the first bodies were discovered, technology has advanced faster than anyone imagined. DNA has identified victims who once had no names. Databases have linked crimes across states. Cold cases once considered impossible have found resolution. But progress does not move backward easily. In the Texas killing fields, too much was lost too early. Too many scenes were compromised. Too many opportunities passed without recognition. Justice depends on timing as much as effort. Some answers may still be waiting. Advances in forensic genealogy offer hope. A bone fragment, a strand of hair, a partial profile. These are small things, but sometimes small things reopen large doors. Even now, investigators continue to revisit these cases, quietly, carefully, without promises, because hope without honesty becomes another form of harm. What the fields truly left behind is not just unanswered questions. It is a warning about what happens when cases are isolated instead of connected, a warning about whose lives are prioritized, a warning about places that make crime easier when no one is paying attention. The Texas killing fields teach us that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits for convenience. Sometimes it hides behind routine. Sometimes it survives because the system around it moves too slowly to notice. As a detective, you learn to live with incomplete endings. You learn that telling the story may be the only justice you can still offer, because silence is what allowed this place to exist. Speaking about it keeps it from disappearing again. The fields do not ask to be remembered. The victims deserve it. I am Miller Files, and this case remains open, not in a file cabinet, but in the conscience of anyone willing to look past the road and into the grass.